Cryogenics. I think it's Cryogenics anyway. There was a bit of a fad, and I don't know if it still goes on now in the US. I don't think it's happened in Europe. Though I'm sure you probably can get it done if you've the money. But after death, you can be frozen. Put in a chamber, minus whatever, boom, you're there. And in the future, if they find some way of curing your death, curing your illness, they can, they'll bring you back and you go, hi, how's it going? I'm back. I find the logic quite questionable about this whole affair, because I suppose if you're relatively healthy when you die, you're not very old, most things are in good working order, then I can see a little bit of logic in let's freeze this guy, or girl. But then if you're old, you're in your 80s, you're pretty knackered. Do you really want to be like that when you wake up? In the year 2257. I'm not sure that's a good idea, unless you're suggesting that when you do wake up, they've repaired everything, and you've got the body of an 18-year-old. I don't know. And I do understand there's a cheaper version where you don't have to freeze your complete body. You can just freeze your head. Yeah, I'm not sure about that now. Freezing your head. Ooh. That's sort of even worse, really. Can you imagine waking up and you've no body? Wow. Oh, body of an 18-year-old. I think that'd be pretty creepy too, actually, but I suppose it was a good one. Yeah, interesting. It's interesting that, we have this, whatever you want to call it, this shell, this carcass, that essentially is doing things for us, from our brain, from our consciousness. And we get very attached to it, don't we? I think it's, I know when people lose limbs and things, they have, you can get like ghost limb feelings, like almost like the brain's missing the limb. It's quite amazing, really. You can get some quite distressful feelings as well around that. But I think that, I think the body is definitely part of us, makes up us. And if you used to just take the brain out and stick it in something else, I don't know. It's not the same, is it really? Not the same at all. But anyway, talking about preserving and preservation. I think I mentioned this before in another episode, but that was so good, I'm going to mention it again. And you probably don't listen to all of these, which, I wouldn't expect you to listen to every single episode. I think there's varying quality, both in audio and the sort of stuff that I talk about. But anyhow, so yeah, so the idea of preserving yourself is quite interesting. And there's bodies of people being found, in the Himalayas and various cold places, and they've been very well preserved. But I mean, they are bodies, and you warm them up a little bit, and they're mushy bodies, aren't they? But I think my favourite one that I ever heard about, and it's very interesting this because it wasn't publicised at the time because of various things going on around the world, but from a few different sources, it's pretty plausible and yeah, could be true, So around 1907, the first part of the 20th century, an iceberg detached itself, from the Arctic, the North Pole sheet, or whatever you want to call it, or block of ice that covers the North Pole, and gently started drifting, meandering southwards. And roughly the same time, the first bit of metal, the first bit of the keel, first few bolts were put together of a ship you might have heard of called the Titanic. Maybe a year or two later, I don't know, it was around that time frame. But as we should know, on its maiden voyage, the Titanic across the Atlantic, Edward J. Smith, the captain, some say he was speeding, and that was a factor. Wants to, get a record or something for the boat. He was ready for retirement. I don't believe it was his last voyage, but it was his last voyage. I don't think he was going to retire that quickly after, but literally he was ready for retirement. He was the most experienced captain across the Atlantic. So on a fateful night in April, now there was actually, because the Earth's a globe, and sailing quite far north can mean you cut the distance down. So they used to take quite a northerly route to New York. I think nowadays boats are not allowed to go that far north, or they don't in general, because there's always the danger of icebergs. And even at certain times of night, certain times of day, they can be very hard to spot. And what do they always say? The old adage, it's the tip of the iceberg. So you see the tip sticking out, and the rest of it's under the water and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, so it can be a big problem. I do believe there's a survey now, some survey planes that go from Canada and that sort of area. I do believe satellites probably do it as well. I mean, I'm sure they're well able to. I could find out, but I'm not going to. I don't Google unless I really have to. So it happened. The Titanic, it glanced and blow off an iceberg, ripped a hole in its hull, and it sank. In a little less than the length of the movie the Titanic made by James Cameron many years later, and released in 1999. So yeah, it sank a little bit quicker than the length of the movie. And it was awfully sad, the number of people who died. Both the crew numbers were horrendous, and those in third class. It was a horrible disaster. There was not enough lifeboats. It was terrible. And what is interesting is probably 50, 60, I think it was 1970, so that'll be about 60 odd years later. The Cold War, you may have heard of, and the Iron Curtain, and this was the antagonistic behaviour between the Americans and the Russians. And the Russians came up with this Iron Curtain because it was in charge of a few countries in Eastern Europe, and there was very, shall we say, not much information came out. I doubt much information went in either. And they were sort of at each other for a few years there now. I don't think there was ever a chance someone was going to push the button, but it was hanging, it was lingering there that someone might pop a few nuclear weapons either way. But both sides knew they'd both come out horribly badly, so it never happened. But around that time, and it's still the same to this day, the superpowers have submarines. They're going to be away for months on end, sailing around the world really. I suppose ready just in case the unthinkable might happen. Anyway, this particular submarine, sometime in the 1970s, happened upon an iceberg in the North Atlantic. I don't know the exact location. I don't know if these things... So if it carried on heading south, it would have melted away completely, wouldn't it? So, or however it meandered or wherever it was, they found an iceberg with a very large black mark on one side. And they could see a little dot on the top of the iceberg. And as they got closer, they saw it was a body. It was a woman, a young woman actually, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, obviously dead, lying on the iceberg, but perfectly preserved. The iceberg and the location had kept her perfectly frozen for 50 years. That's a long time, isn't it? Anyway, when they did pick her up, and there was comments on how lifelike she looked, and her lipstick looked like it was, freshly put on, which is interesting. They say they made some attempts to revive her, but of course, when you realise what happens when things freeze and the destruction of the cells, even if you warm them up gently, I think the damage has already been done, really. They wasn't able to revive her, of course, but I do find it very interesting. But I'm starting to think about maybe that this story might not be true. And there's a few things that worry me about the story. One thing would be the iceberg. Would it still be around after 50 years? Would it still be enough of it that it's still got the marks of the Titanic on it? Would it be still enough of it that because it's going to be melting, isn't it, slowly? It's heading south, it's going to be melting. We've got global warming, it's going to be melting. It's certainly not getting colder, is it? And it drifted around for 50 years. Is that possible? Yeah, I'm starting to wonder now. There's a part of me who thinks I might do more research on this, but I'm not so sure. But whatever the story is, true or not, it's quite fascinating.